Bonjour à tous et toutes. Thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me, and thanks to all of you for coming. I'm just thrilled to be here. As was saying, I'm going to focus on the topic today, understanding people, and how I think that's really transforming our communities, campuses, and really companies around the world in the digital age. And when I saw the title of this conference initially, I noticed that there were three themes that are often talked about conferences and so on individually. Certainly a lot on globalization, internationalization, certainly a lot on the media, and certainly a lot on on higher ed. And you see gatherings that focus on two of the three, perhaps, but getting all three together seems to me the magic of our session here and the genius of the organizers. And I think that's really key, and I jumped at the chance. Now, obviously, what's driving this at some level is the extension of mass schooling to the higher education level. And certainly it's the case in Canada now. More than half the population is completing some post-secondary education, and that's a trend we see across. Some of the differences here have to do with definitions and so on, but the trend is there. Well, you could say this is simply an extension of things, right? We're simply building on what happened. The story of the 19th century was the story of mass schooling at the elementary school level. Going to school became characteristic of growing up during the 19th century. By the end of the 19th century, that pattern we could see in many countries. Similarly, you could say the 20th century was the story of mass high school. During the course of the 20th century, that became an increasingly characteristic of growing up. And then you could say, well, higher education, mass schooling in terms of what we see now, that we can look forward to a similar kind of development. I think there's some truth to that, but I think what this conference is focusing on is the extent to which it's not only that. Is post-secondary education simply becoming the 21st century version of 19th century elementary schools and 20th century high schools? And to what extent? And similarly, you could ask, well, what about new media, for example? Is that becoming the 21st century version of 19th century newspapers, which really became so characteristic of that century, or, for example, radio and then TV during the course of the 20th century? I think what this conference focuses on, and some of the themes, and what I'd like to just highlight a bit in these opening remarks, is this sense that it's only in part. And in fact, what we really are focusing on is the extent to which we're building on the past. I'm an historian, and usually an historian's role all the time. When anyone says something's new, our mission in life is to jump up and say, no, 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 no. There's precedent for that. So we tend to be on the side of continuity. But my sense in terms of what we're learning at the Social Science and Humanities Research Council, in terms of what the research world is really telling us, in fact, is that we're moving far beyond that. And I want to focus initially on why, and try to situate some of the key themes that we'll be focusing on in this conference in terms of the driving forces of why. Why are we seeing this, and why is it so important now, and what is the research telling us about how we might move forward? My premise is this. I think if we listen to the research world, if we look at what's happening across our campuses, in fact, around the world, there's a new sense that, in fact, the world, the key distinguishing part of our planet is we have humans. Now, you'd say, Chad, no, wait a minute. We've been worrying about human beings since way back. We can go back to the earliest time, and clearly, whether it's in writings or whatever, there's a focus on people and trying to understand people. You can't say it's new. I say yes, but let's take the case of schools. We built those schools in the 19th century. They were developed on a certain model. One thing that we didn't really focus on, though, is how children learn. So that's kind of interesting. Now, the results of that were, frankly, we know now, were not always great. I think every prof's looked up and maybe seen that. Hopefully I haven't looked up and seen that. But I think it's clear that it's really only in the last few decades, and Glenn and his colleagues have played such a huge role in this, that we've really started to pose the question. How do children learn best? How do we all learn best throughout our lives? And what does that mean for the way in which we organize schools, the way in which we organize formal education, the way in which we organize campuses, and so on? And that's why I know this morning, for example, that my presentation, I get roughly 18 minutes. After 18 minutes, you start thinking, what's for dinner tonight? Those email messages, I better check them. The human brain, your ability to sit there and get the broadcast and absorb that. I used to always think in 90-minute lectures that meant that, first 18 minutes it's going in, next 18, 20 minutes it's stopped, and then it starts to go the other way. You always figure you leave students just a little worse than when you first met them. And that's why all the debates we see today, notions of trying to flip the classroom, for example, we'll be talking a lot about new ways of thinking about organizing schools in terms of T-shaped models in which the whole framework of how we organize the curriculum and so on is fundamentally changing. And I think, and that goes far in terms of trying to move toward an engagement model, learning that how we learn and how we really acquire competencies and transmission of knowledge on is not something in which we can just give it to you, open the proverbial hole in your head. We talk about T-shaped knowledge, skills. Now there's notions of renewable competencies. Notion that, discipline-based specialization, yes, but you have to put that in a context and make those kind of connections. And this issue about trying to lead and manage across a lot of those traditional kinds of boundaries, whether they're on campus, whether they're across sectors, whether they're international, and so on. And I think we're fundamentally rethinking that, partly because we really want to enhance learning in keeping with how human beings learn. And there are lots of examples of this in terms of co-op programs, in-service learning, paid internships, collaborative research, innovation projects, exchange curriculum, new forms of recognition, badges. All those efforts, I think, are reflective of our efforts now, having taken seriously the challenge of really trying to understand how people learn and how that can really help them in terms of contributing to the larger society. So here's the claim that I think is coming out of the research world pretty consistently now, and that is, now that we've really started to take seriously the challenge of understanding human thought and behavior, we've really started to focus on this, that we're seeing things differently. That deep conceptual changes are underway, and as a result of that, we are really embracing digital technologies in ways that have consistently been underestimated at each wave of the technological change, back to Watson and at the time of the Second World War, predicting we'd only need 5 mainframe computers, on and on. Every time the uptake has gone beyond the expectation, and Karen was suggesting this internationally in really interesting ways. Why? Because it's enabling these deep conceptual changes, and I think that's what we want to focus on. So, what is the research telling us? The research is telling us that we're living in a paradigm-shifting era. And again, for an historian to say that, it's big, and the most dramatic transformation, I think, really, and a lot of the researchers are pushing on this side since the emergence of print culture. So what's the challenge for us all? And I think why this conference is so important in pushing forward in terms of trying to embrace this challenge. How do we take advantage of enhanced understandings of people in the past and present? And how do we do that? We have to do it by developing new policies and practices nationally and internationally to improve quality of life and build successful societies in the 21st century. So that's the context, and I think that's the drivers of why these topics are so important and why the interrelating of those themes is so important. Campuses now are being seen as embedded in the context of communities, and that's across sectors. Any notion that campuses are distant from and isolated from in a way that's disconnected from what's going on in the larger society is not there. Similarly, I think this notion that campuses at the heart of communities and really embedded in communities, I think, is key. We also, and we'll talk about this later in terms of the notion of universities as hubs, and what does that mean, and how can we think through that in terms of how research can really help make that better world in an engaged kind of way. Similarly, I think technology is obviously out there. Our conference is going to be talking about MOOCs, for example, and a debate about that. For me, the key aspect of that discussion is that simply extending an old broadcast way of thinking about the push of teaching, or is it really enhancing learning? And I think there are lots of examples, and you'll be talking about them in those sessions. Similarly, I think in terms of measuring, in terms of how we think about that, one of the key aspects is this rankings issue. And one of the things that's so interesting is all the different kinds of measures and indicators that are at play. And how do we think about that? What's that way to think about? Are we really enhancing learning? What is the learning outcomes? Are we helping make a better society and so on? And how do we do that? And once we move beyond some of those old school notions of, oh, we'll just count patents or some of that older kind of focus, then it makes it really interesting in terms of, well, how do we do that and how do we embrace this new model? And what does that mean in terms of how we think about institutions, the branding issue that you're all going to be focusing on? What does that mean? How do we come to grips with that? And I think that's a really interesting aspect of what you'll be talking about. Crowdsourcing is so interesting because now the notion of all the experts, the real authorities being on campus and then announcing to the rest of the world their discoveries, and we get a small number and the rest of us are waiting for this. Now we have very new notions of where that comes from, and we'll talk about that. The whole notion of ask the audience and all those trends that show that in fact that's a really good idea. Also, community-based research. Very different ways of thinking about community and moving beyond that notion of just push knowledge out and a much more what Karen was talking about, that two-way, that engaged way of thinking, the co-creation way of thinking about moving forward. Citizen science is back in new ways, and there are different levels of that, which is really interesting, and I'm sure you'll be talking about. Last night there was a really interesting discussion about who to trust. And how do we develop those notions? And what does that mean at all sorts of levels in terms of knowledge, in terms of expertise, and so on? And I think those are some of the really key issues at play now for reasons that were not at play back in the day. When you think about those 19th and 20th century urban industrial models that I've been suggesting are moving. So I want to focus now for a few minutes on why. Why are we seeing such major changes? Why is the 21st century not a bigger version of the 19th and 20th centuries? And how can we build a better future? And what does that mean? Well, my sense is that the research says, and what we've been seeing at the Research Council, is that the notion of moving forward really does depend on these understandings, and I think enhanced understandings of the past and present, especially better understandings of human thought and behavior. And then we have to imagine the future we want and work toward it. And I emphasize that a little bit in the sense of that imagining part, I think, has been underplayed. In the Canadian context, Northrop Frye, we're all so proud of him, and internationally he's had such a great impact. And I think one of the aspects of his work that I think is really relevant is this notion that in fact, the imagination is really key to this, and he phrases it this way in terms of the fundamental job of the imagination, and that is to really produce out of the society we have to live in, the one that's around us, the vision of the society we want to live in. I emphasize this because sometimes the discussions about the 21st century, there's a certain deterministic end of it. There's kind of a preordained future that comes out of this. And it's not just coming out of genomics and so on, but there's somehow this notion, I think, that the future is really, we're victims of trends and so on, and there's not much we can do. At the Social Science and Humanities Research Council, we want to take the view that says, look, I think if we do focus in terms of understanding human thought and behavior, we can in fact use that to help make a better world at all kinds of different levels. In other words, we can make the future that we want. And I think that's the way to think about it. One of the little projects that we've done recently that's really been tremendous in terms of pan-Canadian collaboration and participation has been our project Imagining Canada's Future, and placing that in a global context and trying to do it in a Northrop Frye way, and really suggesting, in fact, that this is really key. Why do we say human thought and behavior is so key to this and trying to improve things through better understandings of human thought and behavior? Because we see it across society, and the research on this is really bringing to our attention that across the sectors, private, public, nonprofit sectors, there really is a focus now on people. And I want to think about this in a few different ways in terms of what, for example, are businesses doing? Businesses now are really customer-focused in the marketplace. Who are the customers? You know, the old model that you would build a product, get a good advertiser, and then try to convince people to buy it has really changed. That push has really changed, and there's a great new interest. And that's why we see the data mining, we see all the efforts to try to figure out human thought and behavior, why are we doing what we're doing, why do we prefer, and so on. And you can walk across the sectors in terms of how to improve user experience in the service industries, really trying to understand who are users across. Similarly, in terms of collaboration, in terms of partnership, how to really partner effectively. How do you do that in terms of that two-way, multiple directional kind of way? In terms of workplaces, all of a sudden the idea is, no, I give you a job, sit there and do what I tell you to do. And it's again, trying to imagine an employee-empowered workplace and realizing that a lot of innovation, a lot of good ideas, a lot of creativity come from employees. It's not just top-down sending out memos. It's an engagement model, very, very different. Obviously, in politics, we see this now. In terms of citizen engagement, we have lots of examples of successful politicians in terms of social media, on, trying to engage and listen and learn. There are a lot of other not so great examples, but I think that clearly there's a new focus. And as I said earlier, in terms of student learning, in terms of really trying to understand how students learn, start there rather than how we think we really should teach. And in health, all of a sudden now it's a new strategic focus, patient-oriented. It's not about just the teachers and so on. It's not just about the physicians. It's about patients and trying to understand and embrace how is health related to how people are thinking, feeling, acting, on and on. Very different world. And of course, these are all connected. The same human being is the customer, is the student, is the patient, on and on. And how does that all connect together, and what can we learn from that? This is so different because, frankly, the focus on how to make a better world for much of the post-Second World War period was based on better technology. It was based on the notion that really of a lab to market. We're going to get better widgets, we're going to get better things, and that's going to help us make a better world. And I think increasingly, even in the private sector, there's a new view on that. There's a new view, in fact, that understanding people is the most critical business strategy today. And I think that's an example of what's happening across the sectors. And that's why, for example, that our fields have become so important in terms of thinking about innovation, thinking about how to build a better world. And now it's not just STEM, but it's graduates in the social science, humanities, and increasingly those T-shaped graduates that are really playing an important role. So let's think about, I'm just going to juxtapose just to emphasize this a bit, that old tech transfer model of the push out from campuses to the larger society, and now the push and pull and engagement kind of model. It used to be that one-way flow, and now it's multi-directional flows. Campus, community, back and forth, not just tech transfer, but people moving ideas and knowledge in interesting ways. No more that linear recipe, but rather non-linear engagement and all the complexity associated with that. Not that transmission, experts to receptors, but much more a notion of innovation participants across sectors in a learning way. The Governor General emphasized, and those introducing today certainly emphasized, not just about the tools, but how those tools are used, and that's really the important aspect, not just the STEM disciplines, but in fact across the campus, social science, humanities, arts, design, on and on. Not the autonomous roles, we're not adding up individually, but then networks, partnership, clusters, and so on, and not just physical contact. We certainly need that, but also taking advantage of the virtual communities. So, all that to say, we're no longer living in what's seen as a technology-driven age. Technology is not driving us, but rather it's these deep conceptual changes that are being enabled, accelerated, and influenced in iterative ways by digital technology. So, well, let's drill down on this. What are those deep conceptual changes? Can we go even further and talk a bit about them? I think there's many we can think about. The three that jump to our mind in terms of what the research world is telling us right now. One is complexity, a new way to think about complexity. One is diversity, a new way to think about diversity. And the third is creativity, a new way to think about creativity. Well, so what do we mean by that? Well, I think in terms of creativity, I'll start there. Again, we're going from an assumption for centuries of really a tiny group of creators, often a preordained elite, and we know how that goes, often men, often those from certain socioeconomic groups, cultural groups, and so on, to a much more, and then their expertise, those were the creative people, they were going to then give it to the rest of us, that we would simply apply that. Now we're trying to tap the entire pool of talent, and we understand that that can be from anywhere and so on. And how do we do that? And it's really a fundamental different way of thinking about creativity. Similarly, in terms of diversity, we used to think that diversity was basically a problem to be eliminated. You know, and that's why in terms of curriculum, all sorts of things, the effort was really to get rid of. Uniformity was good, single languages for countries, on and on. And now the mission is to really say, well, diversity is in fact the foundation of strength and resilience. That sameness, it leads to vulnerability, and it leads to all sorts of issues. And this is true whether it's genetic diversity, economic diversity, on and on. Diversity is now seen as really that foundation of strength and resilience. A fundamentally different way of thinking about such a key concept. And similarly, complexity. The conviction that complexity is really only apparent, and that beneath that is really, you know, simple things that we can understand one by one in a kind of building block way. And now we see complexity as a common phenomenon. The complexity, the deep dynamic interrelationships kind of side of complexity, and that's a cross phenomena. And we can't simply add up things and get the whole, but rather we have to understand their complex, context-dependent interrelationships. And we'll talk more about that. So, well, what does that all mean? What do those changed concepts mean? Well, I think it helps us understand how we're trying to reimagine campuses. Why, in terms of education, we've moved from the notion of just teaching content, that transmission of knowledge approach, to learning content and competencies, this whole notion of developing talent, which is, I think, a much different way of thinking about what we're doing. Similarly, in terms of research, moving from the notion that really specialization is great in that pyramid, starting out in elementary school all the way up to the PhD, we're increasingly specialized, and we think that that's the way to go to a kind of a much different way. I like the notion of the research T, for example. A lot of researchers now showing the extent to which simply increased specialization has limits, and it can't be additive, that contextualization is really key. And certainly in terms of innovation, as we said, it's not technology, it's not just technology transfer, but it's this people-centered notion of innovation, integrated innovation, social innovation, open innovation, on and on, a really 21st century notion, very different. What does that mean in terms of new modes of engagement? It means different kind of conversations and connections across campus. It means connecting campuses and communities, connecting Canada and the world. And again, not doing it in a one-way way, doing it in a mutual way, a two-way, multi-directional way, an engagement model in which there's learning on all sides. And that's certainly the case in terms of the media, higher education. That learning model, learning from both sides, I think is so key. One of the most interesting dynamics that's clear at the heart of the digital age is these connections in terms of the fields. And I think Steve Jobs had a good way of thinking about this, and it frankly explains a lot of Apple's success in terms of his notion that the magic, that what really makes our hearts sing is connecting the technology with the liberal arts, with the humanities. Another way of saying that, I would say, is with human beings, with human thought and behavior. And I think that's really at the heart. But people are not particles. In terms of those kind of conversations, those kind of engagement interactions, people are, a molecule is a molecule, but In fact, individuals are unique, and our context matters. I think a molecule in Canada, a molecule in Africa is still a molecule, whereas people, whether we, the same person, context matters, unique individuals. At the same time, we also know that it's not simply we're all completely disconnected. In fact, there's a lots to share. And I want to emphasize just a little bit the extent to which the digital age is really helping us open possibilities in terms of really probing and understanding both the specificity and what we share across human beings. The OECD has published recently something that really embraced this notion, in fact, that understanding the human condition based on the new data, it really does open up the extent, the possibilities in ways that in the analog world were by definition limited. And so this notion of data-driven or evidence-based research for understanding and really addressing the global challenges in terms of quality of life, in terms of well-being, on, I think is really at the heart of this. So one way to think about our digital age is in terms of a triangle, in terms of, yes, one side, there are technologies, and that's key. There's been a lot of emphasis on that. But on the other side, there's a question of content. And I mean that in a very robust way, metadata, on. And even more importantly, it seems to me, is this digital literacies. It's something that we haven't really focused on the extent to which we're just starting to now, and I know many of your discussions will. And that's what's framing our age. And it seems to me that we got to think about these terms in equilateral triangle, that the magic is really all of them framing together. Well, what does this mean? Well, in terms of thinking about libraries, for example, the possibilities of how we can analyze the written word, for example, is really interesting. Now, obviously, at some level, you could say, well, this is just, we can do more of what we've been doing in the past. But I think there's obviously clearly, and you'll be focusing on a lot, the extent to which the written word even opens up new possibilities in terms of our understanding that when you think about it in terms of data and how we can analyze and think through that semantic web, on. And I think overall this is part of something in which we're really reimagining the role of authors, editors, publishers, on. And we move from thinking about that in terms of specific products to thinking about the real role that's being played here. And that's in terms of the filtering, the curation roles, and so on, and how does that work? And I think a lot of the sessions are really going to try to unpack that. And what does that mean in terms of different kinds of means to that end, whether they're print, whether they're electronic, on. And how do we think about that? One result of all that is, in fact, the data tsunami, the fact that the possibilities on this are so huge, and how do we come to grips with that, to really use it in terms of understanding people, human thought and behavior? Well, at Social Science and Humanities Research Council, we've been engaged in this. We've been working with colleagues in the US, Europe, or in fact around the world, and one of our efforts is digging into data challenge, and we challenged our researchers to say, well, how can we really take advantage of the possibilities to enhance understandings of people in the past and present? And I invite you to look at some of the projects, everything from music through text, on. Just a fabulous array of possibilities. Attracted a lot of media attention around the world. What I think is so interesting is the interactions between, for example, humanists looking at text, and biologists and others looking at DNA, and a lot of the similarities, challenges, trying to use those digital corpus in order to enhance our understandings. When you see across the world now, you see new digital humanities centers increasingly connected in international webs, and I think there's some really interesting possibilities there. You saw just last week the G8 published an open data charter and I think is really pushing on the side of the possibilities of using these new digital technologies, the digital content, the digital literacies to really enhance our understandings of the physical and non-physical world, I think is so interesting. A phrase that we like a lot better than that old tech transfer notion is knowledge mobilization, the iterative across campus, campus community, back and forth engagement model, and we've been funding a lot of that, and so many researchers, students, media, learning from each other. It's a very different way of thinking about that. Later today, and I invite you, my colleague Ursula Goebel will be presenting one of our initiatives at SSHRC, the Storytellers, the SSHRC Storytellers Initiative, where we really invited students to step forward and think about new ways in which they could engage, they could tell the story, they could really reach out and embrace some of the challenges and opportunities that they see in terms of their own research, and you'll get lots of good examples of that. And I think the reason is that we realize that, you know, yes, research matters, but it's really how we communicate, how we tell that story is really so important. We've taken this to heart in terms of our program architecture at our Research Council, and this is similar to others around the world. We feel we've probably gone further along these lines. We basically erased the board on our program architecture and said, what would a 21st century approach look like? We landed on notions of developing talent, gaining insight, making those kind of connections, and doing it in partnership wherever appropriate, and I think that's helping us in terms of supporting the top scholars and students and research partners across society. Clearly, we have a long way to go. There are major challenges that all of us are facing, and I think this conference and your sessions that are coming up are really going to help us coming to grips with a basic question: who pays, who owns, who controls, the privacy, intellectual and personal property issues, digital divides, which are so important across social inequality, those Gini coefficients that have been surprising at some level and increasing concern, issues on preservation, curation, access, on. And I think there's so much work to do. But my sense as well is that we're really at the start of an amazing journey. Anything that doesn't get nailed down during this conference, I invite you to Montreal in mid-October, international event. We have 60 countries currently confirmed in terms of participation. Come into the website. We're focusing on social transformations in the digital age. The International Social Science Council is bringing together, and we're supporting at SSHRC, and many of you are supporting, and I think we're going to try to build on this conversation and move forward. So let me close by saying, okay, is it an issue about simply knowing the future? Well, let's say that we can make the future we want. And what's the reason for optimism about that? Well, let's think about it. 100 years ago, Einstein is basically sitting there, paper and pencil, doing thought experiments, thinking things through. Well, during the course of the 20th century, we got serious about that. An enormous amount of time and energy has been gone into an investment into, was he right? What did he think? How did that work? How can we think about that? Colliding particles, on, and I think we've made huge advances. Still a world to go, but I think huge advances. Similarly, you could say for a long time, centuries, there was a notion of life in outer space. We could take ourselves into outer space, space travel. And after the Second World War, this is from 1952, there was a decision, you know, we should really make this a priority. And through the later decades, we've certainly seen huge success in terms of human beings going to space. I think the invitation for us is to say, can we, now that we've started to take seriously the challenge of understanding human beings, human thought and behavior in the past and present? In the recent decades, we've shown that something as basic as the creation of mass schooling, that we can do much better in terms of, now that we've begun to focus on how we learn, for example. Is it possible for us to say, well, the 21st century is going to be the century in which we take seriously, in a really robust way, the challenge of understanding people in the past and present, and we use that across society to really build the kind of world that we want. I think this conversation is that you're going to have over the next couple of days is really at the heart of that. I think what we're up to is key. And my sense is that all of us want to be able to say that, you know, when our descendants look back on us, did we do all we could to really realize the potential of a century in which we can build people-centered institutions, policies, practices that lead to enhanced quality of life and successful societies? Thank you so much.